back, if we have learned one thing during the course of this administration, it's that sitting back and doing nothing is simply not an option. And in case you're getting yourself up to speed on what is possible, and I was just talking with Chris about this, and I'm certainly doing that, there are states like Colorado where Democrats maintain a trifecta on the state level, and where activists right now are working to present voters with a redistricting ballot measure this November. There's also New York, which is trying to do the same, but for next year. New Jersey Governor Mikey Sherrill has also said her Democratic supermajority may soon look to redistrict. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has signaled he would do the same. But I'm also looking at you, Maryland, where despite Governor Westmore's support, the redistricting effort has largely stalled because the Senate president has stood in the way and continues to as of this night tonight. Now, my first guest tonight served as the Attorney General under President Obama. And in response to today's news of Tennessee, he framed this fight ahead like this. Make no mistake, this fight will be hard, it will be long, and there will be setbacks as well as many victories. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But the arc does not bend on its own. It's now on us, again, to do the necessary work to pull that arc towards justice together. Joining me now is former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. He's now the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. It's great to see you. I have been looking forward to talking to you for some time now, but certainly since the Supreme Court ruling last week. And let me start by asking you about the movement by all these Republican legislatures. I just tried to outline in states like Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee. And we knew Republican governors and legislatures in the South would move quickly after the Supreme Court decision. But tell me how you've been digesting what we have seen happen over just the last week since the decision.
Well, the unbelievably bad decision from the Supreme Court in the Calais case allowed these states to do exactly what it is that they're doing. But what they're doing demonstrates the very need for the continuation of the efficacy of the Voting Rights Act, and in particular, Section 2. If Section 2 was still a viable piece of legislation, we wouldn't have these states going into special session and stripping from black and brown people, and particularly in the South, African-American people, their rights to participate fully in our democracy. The Voting Rights Act was put into place to give African-Americans in the South the ability to be full citizens. And what these state legislatures are in the process of doing is turning back the clock to a pre-1965 America. And that's something that we have to fight. I'm bound and determined to do exactly that.
So let's talk about that, because right after Tennessee passed its newly gerrymandered map today, the NAACP filed an emergency petition to stop it. It's going to be one of many legal challenges as this Republican last-second gerrymander push plays out. In the immediate short term, what recourse can be found in state and federal courts? And I ask this, it's so important because I think it's demoralizing to see what's happening. So what can happen in federal and state courts here?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to look largely to the state courts to try to determine how we push back against this on the legal front. But the reality also is that we underestimate the power that we have as so-called ordinary American citizens, what I like to call extraordinary ordinary American citizens. We have to remember that in our history, the great social movements that this nation has put together and that changed this nation was as a result of the people. Ordinary people getting involved, suffragettes demanding the right to vote for women, black and white kids going down south and ripping down a system of American apartheid. Just recently, extraordinary, ordinary Americans in Minneapolis kicking DHS and ICE out of Minneapolis. All of this happened because the people got together and decided we're not going to stand for the policies that this administration is going to put into place. Now, it's going to take some time. It'll take some time, and people certainly have to vote. People have to organize. People need to ask themselves individually, what is it that I can do to push back against that which they are trying to do? And if each of us does that, if each of us is prepared to commit ourselves to that cause, we can be as successful as other generations have been in the protection and the enhancement of our democracy.
It's such a moment I think people will be telling their grandchildren about where they were, or maybe their great-grandchildren. Let me ask you about another development. The Republican governor of Louisiana, of course, declared a special emergency to halt the state's congressional primary election so Republicans can implement a new map after tens of thousands of voters had already cast their ballots. There's obviously a lot of litigation around that, but You think about this a lot, both the legal possibilities, the political possibilities. Is this a precedent that we should be worried about down the road? I mean, leading up to this November, past this November, canceling elections, I should say.
Yeah, I think that this is something that we ought to be very concerned about. This is tampering in an election process in the most gross of ways. I mean, an election was already underway in Louisiana. About 42,000 people had already cast their votes. And then the governor declares an emergency. Now, first off, the governor can't declare an emergency in the way that he's trying to do. The Louisiana state constitution says only the legislature can make decisions about the timing of elections. But he declares an emergency. I'm not exactly sure what the emergency was. And then he halts the election. It's almost as if you're in an election and you look at the polls and you make the determination, well, you know, if we hold the election right now, we're not going to do too well. So let's postpone it until we can get to a better time and perhaps enhance our chances of winning. And that's in essence what the governor has done. He's now been supported, or will be supported, by the Republican-dominated legislature there. And the impact will be to draw maps that will strip away from African Americans in Louisiana rights for which they have fought for so long, rights that they had only granted to them by the Supreme Court just a couple of years or so ago. Again, a reversion back to that which is a dark chapter in American history.
I mentioned a couple of the states where there is potential for action. In the past, I should just note, you have advocated, as many people have, and as we all should, to adopt independent redistricting committees. Many of us would love to see something like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act pass, of course. But in the short term, as people out there are trying to educate themselves, inform themselves on kind of where there are states, which states they should be watching or looking to, where action to redraw maps could happen to try to level the playing field, what are you watching most closely? What should people out there be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, the states that you talked about, you know, Colorado, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, potentially Maryland, you know, in whatever other states that we can look at and see where there are possibilities of redrawing maps to make sure that we respond to that which the Republicans have done. And people need to understand this. We wouldn't be in this crisis but for the way in which Donald Trump initiated it. He was the one who started this whole thing by saying he needed 5 seats out of Texas. And I think they expected us, that is progressives, people who care about our democracy, Democrats, to simply say, well, you know, I'll go on television and I'll bemoan the fact that what they did, I'll write an op-ed. And my determination, I think the determination of many of us, was that, no, we're going to fight back. You know, we have to deal with this crisis that they have presented us with and make sure that we win in this crisis so that ultimately we can heal our democracy. And healing the democracy, I think, ultimately is going to mean that we're going to have to pass federal legislation to ban partisan and racial gerrymandering. But to get to that point, we have to make sure that we save our democracy so that we have the capacity to do that. You know, people need to understand, we need to look at history. You know, authoritarianism rose in Europe in the early part of the 20th century, not because authoritarianism was strong, but because the defense of democracy was weak. And we cannot repeat that mistake. The risks are entirely too high.